Hello and welcome to Today's Take, the podcast that takes you behind the headlines to understand the story that shapes the story that you see on TV. I'm Jane Azzopardi, and this week we are diving deep into a political firestorm that's not just dominating the news, but also creating something of a rift within one of America's most powerful political movements. We're talking about Donald Trump, Jeffrey Epstein, and the surprising backlash from his own MAGA base. Here are some of this week's headlines. Donald Trump is marking the 6-month anniversary of his second term by claiming it is one of the most consequential periods for any US president. Live to 9 US correspondent Jonathan Kersley in Los Angeles. Jono, he is still being dogged though by one big issue.
One particular issue indeed, Jane, and that is the release of the so-called Epstein files relating to documents of the case of business financier and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, who was a one-time associate of US President Donald Trump. He had campaigned on this issue, and Republicans are pressuring him and those closest to him to do more. He's asked a federal court to unseal documents related to grand jury testimony, today taking to Truth Social to insist that pressure over this scandal, over this issue, in which he calls a hoax, has seen his poll numbers go up to 95%.
A US federal judge has denied the Trump administration's appeal to unseal documents from the criminal investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. The US president has faced mounting pressure to release further details about the sex offender. It comes as the Wall Street Journal reports Trump was told by his Attorney General that his name appeared in the files.
I understand there are 2 other requests from the Department of Justice that are ongoing, but I'll let this president speak to whether he wants to see an appeal.
Now, to help us unpack this complex and evolving story, we are joined by Nine's US correspondent, Jonathan Kersley. Jono, thank you so much for being here.
Always happy to talk to you and the listeners, Jane.
All right, we're going to go right back to the beginning here. So much has happened in this story, but I want you to tell us about Jeffrey Epstein. Rich and powerful, friends in high places, but also a convicted sex offender who took his own life while in custody for more alleged crimes. What's his story?
Well, the personal story of Jeffrey Epstein is long, it is complex. 1953, born in Brooklyn to the children of Jewish immigrants. He spent much of his childhood there and starting his business interests through the 80s and 90s. And it was a business empire that turned him into a millionaire. And with that came this incredibly powerful circle of friends and associates. Business elites, it even included royalty in some parts, and then came a move to Florida where he spent a significant amount of time. And it was kind of during that period then that we now know he came to know Donald Trump, a man he says he would be the closest friend of for some 15 years or so. His story then moved from the business and financier world into an area that, as you mentioned, is criminal charges. He came across authorities concerned about his interests around about 2005, eventually spending some 13 months or so in prison. But that is a fascinating aspect in itself, Jane, because not only was he charged and pleaded guilty under this very controversial plea deal, but essentially he was allowed to leave jail during the day to go to work and then to come home at night time, serving 13 months of that 18-month sentence on child sex offences. And then, as I say, there was another investigation that launched by a local journalist in Miami in Florida that uncovered around about 80 alleged victims, 80 alleged survivors of what it has said taken place in a very, very murky world indeed. And by that point, really, well, the net was closing in on Jeffrey Epstein. The charges came around about July 2019, and then by August of that year, so a month or so later, he was found hanging in his cells. And 6 years on, though, the Jeffrey Epstein story is still going. Here we are talking about it today in relation to the job of the most high-profile and most powerful person in the world now.
Well, speaking of that man, you touched on it then, but what exactly was Epstein's relationship with Donald Trump?
Well, Epstein's relationship with Donald Trump was one that was very, very close for about 15 years. The late 80s, early 90s, they came to know each other. They spent a lot of time together. Jeffrey Epstein has been heard in tapes previously describing himself as the closest friend of Donald Trump. We now know he attended his wedding, first wedding to Miss Marple's back in the early 90s, around about 1993 or so. And we have obviously seen the video of them hanging out together. They spent time together. Donald Trump flew on Jeffrey Epstein's plane. These were two high-profile figures who, it has been said before, had spent much of their time interested in women. Donald Trump, of course, was owning Miss Universe pageants, Miss World pageants. Jeffrey Epstein was moving in these circles, and he was moving in the circles of high profile, of elite individuals. And here is Donald Trump standing right next to him at a time when Donald Trump's business empire was surging too. Trump Tower was booming, the Trump industry was surging, and here you had this relationship between these two men. But it did break down, Jane, around about 2004. There was a property dispute over a house in Palm Beach. That is where the two men had essentially come to know each other. It is Donald Trump's backyard, we now know. But they had this falling out over a property dispute and then didn't speak for some 15 years or so. So it must have been, whatever the detail was in that conversation, in that bust-up, it must have been hugely significant because they never really spoke again.
Yeah, they went from best bros in a way to not talking to each other. Now, Epstein obviously died before the latest case ever got to the court. And as you mentioned, he was able to kill himself while he was in custody, supposedly while he was on suicide watch. No CCTV within the jail of when that happened. And that whole scenario has really fueled a whole bunch of conspiracy theories about there being some kind of cover-up. So what information were people hoping that Epstein might reveal if he did ever appear before the courts?
Well, we've been hearing for years conspiracy theories and ideas around Jeffrey Epstein. Who was he associating with? Who went to his so-called island? Who flew on his private jet? The fight over the flight logs has been going on for years now. His death only surged those conspiracy theories even further. It led to questions over, was he actually murdered? Those very questions were actually being asked by Jeffrey Epstein's own lawyer. He was the one that started the conversation, suggesting no, Jeffrey Epstein couldn't have hung himself. He couldn't have hanged himself, that this had to have been murder inside custody. And that has spurred various conspiracy theories over the course of the years. I think this time around, and what we heard from Republicans over the course of the campaign in the last couple of years or so, is the demand, the urge to release what they call the Epstein files. This call had been pushed by podcasters and YouTubers on the right-wing commentators who were essentially saying to their listeners and to their viewers, there's going to be very, very high-profile figures in these documents. There might even be a list. So we should, as the public, have the right to see who Jeffrey Epstein was dealing with. Who was he associating with? He was accused of some very, very grim crimes indeed, some very, very serious sexual crimes. Sex trafficking is essentially right at the top of the list. As some of the worst crimes you could imagine possible. And so people were obviously wanting to know exactly what was in the list, what was in the details, and who, if there even was a list, who is on that list. And what you've got now is this extraordinary standoff where those who for months and months and months have been calling for this information to be put public, to be out there, to be in the public domain, are now essentially being told, whoa, some of these documents don't even exist. This information isn't even there. That's why you've got this frustration right now in the MAGA base, Jane.
So I guess it seems to me there's sort of this underlying suggestion that these Epstein files, whatever they are, might sort of implicate high-profile people, and that perhaps is why Jeffrey Epstein has never really faced proper justice. As you say, there was that lenient sentence that he had for the earlier charges. Is that kind of what people are suggesting?
Yeah, it's certainly a suggestion that they want to know who Jeffrey Epstein was dealing with when it came to these crimes. Was he working with other accomplices other than Ghislaine Maxwell? Did he have clients when it came to sex trafficking charges? And who were those clients supposedly being, given the fact that he was a person who involved himself in very, very powerful circles, certainly here in the United States and in other parts of the world as well, in Europe, maintaining close relationships with very, very rich individuals individuals who had access to a lot of wealth, a lot of money and a lot of power. We also know Bill Clinton had an association with Jeffrey Epstein as well at some point. So the push from the right here in the United States had been to say, well, there's high-profile figures on the left who are going to be in these documents. Now you've got the left here saying essentially, well, there's going to be high-profile figures from the right in these documents. Whatever these documents may well be. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein's own former lawyer has said he doesn't expect there to be any sort of client list in this. You know, he's yes, there will be federal documents. It will be related to the Department of Justice. There will be a whole range of FBI material. The key question, I suppose, being asked now is there going to be something specifically in these documents that spells out exactly who Jeffrey Epstein dealt with? And that's the stuff that those people who have been calling for this stuff to be released really actually want to see. But now you've got this extraordinary situation where the public is being told, well, no more is going to be released. And that's essentially the end of the road.
And sort of kind of there's lots of questions about what the Epstein files actually are. Do we even know?
Well, I mean, if you envisage them exactly as what they say they are, Epstein files, there are going to be, take this in, the Department of Justice holds these files. It was the FBI doing investigations into him. There were federal authorities who were looking into him. There were state authorities who actually wound up prosecuting him in the end, in that first instance back in 2008. It was state charges he pled guilty to. So the Department of Justice is going to have access to a whole range of material that is going to have the name Jeffrey Epstein in it. There's going to be charge sheets, there's going to be interview records, there's going to be custody records, there's going to be potentially thousands and thousands of pages of documents. I mean, to give you some idea, right? Earlier this week we saw President Trump announce that he was going to be releasing the Martin Luther King files on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights advocate and civil rights leader. When he released those files, there was 230,000 pages across some 3,000 documents. So you could be looking at a similar situation here where there could just be thousands and thousands and thousands of pages that have the words Jeffrey Epstein in them. The question is, though, is what is the context of his associates going to be in those lists? That's the information that people want. And that's what you're hearing Republicans like Tim Burchett here in the United States call for. They're saying, look, forget all of the other stuff. This is about the victims. We want to know who he was dealing with, how he was dealing with them. We want to be able to bring those people to justice. Because if there is some sort of cover-up of high-profile sex offenders, that's the one thing that that people who have been advocating for the release of these documents have been concerned about.
And that's a pretty reasonable thing to want, that if there are sex offenders out there, that they should be brought to light.
Absolutely.
Help us understand Donald Trump's position in all of this. Wasn't he part of the group that was calling for these documents to be released during the election campaign? And has that changed?
Well, he was certainly latching onto that. And you look at the people who were closest to him. J.D. Vance, the now vice president, was saying in forums, we're going to release those files. Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, was one of the loudest voices calling for these files to be released. So too was Dan Bongino, the deputy director at the FBI. There have been senior figures who are now essentially in Trump's inner sanctum who had been pushing for all of this. It had riled the MAGA base, this promise, this idea that they would get the information that they were after, that all of these documents could be made public one day. The president, the now president, was asked in an interview would he release various files. When it got around to the question of the Jeffrey Epstein files, he said, yes, well, perhaps maybe not so much that one, because he was suggesting that there could be, material in there that could be damaging to other people. Well, yes, there may well be, but at that time he was president, he didn't know that. And now you've got this position where essentially the Department of Justice has put out a memo saying, they're not going to be releasing anymore. The president has been pushing back against this. We've heard him very outspoken, calling his own people weaklings for falling to what he's calling a hoax, the Jeffrey Epstein hoax, which is what some commentators here are really latching onto, the idea that it's extraordinary. You could go from a position where these files should all be released to, well, hang on a minute, the whole thing's actually a hoax and they don't exist. So you've got this contrasting image between the campaign Trump and now President Trump. And this is the issue that really is dividing the MAGA base now. He hasn't had one properly in Trump 1.0, and this right now in Trump 2.0 is the big issue that is dividing his own supporters.
Yeah, well, it's really put him at odds with parts of his base. All the people who kind of voted him in there thinking he was going to drain the swamp, as I recall him saying over and over, they're now a little bit disappointed. Is this, what kind of conspiracy theories is this all fueling?
Well, I think you're going to have a look at the long-term impact of this, at least for his base. Now, is it, when you look at conspiracy theories, what is it fueling right now? Well, what it's actually leading to is a major distraction from President Trump, who almost every single day is trying to say something different to take the public's attention somewhere else. Wind the clock back a few months. Remember when Elon Musk and Donald Trump were having that massive falling out? And Elon Musk went nuclear in that conversation by essentially saying Donald Trump is in the Epstein files, and essentially that's why they won't be released. And at that moment it was like, whoa, here's somebody who was an extraordinary close friend, ally of Donald Trump, who has gone to that level in that argument. Now, at this stage, there's no suggestion that anything in the documents that at least the public is being made aware of now suggests that there's any criminal association between Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. The White House is certainly indicating that the president has never done anything wrong when it comes to his association with Jeffrey Epstein. That relationship, that 15-year relationship, it's public knowledge. We've seen photographs emerge this week of Jeffrey Epstein at his wedding back in the early 90s. So the idea that they had a relationship, yes, everybody knows that. But I think right now the MAGA base is torn a little bit because they were told one thing and now they're being told something else entirely different. And now essentially they have their man who they voted in turning around and saying, well, you're weaklings for believing in this investigation, for believing in this idea in the first place anyway, that these files are there, are damaging. He's been trying to water down his own public statements, walk back a lot of what he has said publicly, lashing out at reporters who even ask him about these questions. And now you've got this situation where he's gone to his own Department of Justice, to his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, who's under an extraordinary amount of pressure now, and essentially said, look, get the federal court to unseal the grand jury documents, the grand jury testimony. That might go some way to appeasing the base, but it won't, because they want all of it. They want all the documents. So when it comes to distractions, well, you've had President Trump launch a range of them. Just a matter of days ago, it was Barack Obama accusing him of treason, an extraordinary allegation from one president to launch at a former president. So right now, I think you can certainly tell that Donald Trump really is feeling the heat on this one.
Yeah, and it feels like we're getting sort of drip-fed little tidbits here and there every day. I mean, Rupert Murdoch found himself dragged into the saga this week. Tell us about the story that appeared in the Wall Street Journal and Donald Trump's reaction to that.
Well, you're certainly right on that. There's bits and pieces coming out almost every day now, little tidbits that move in different directions. But yes, the Wall Street Journal, a paper that Rupert Murdoch's News Corp company owns, pushed out what was a very big story this week, basically saying that they had seen a birthday card that had been written by Donald Trump to Jeffrey Epstein for his 50th birthday. It was in a whole bunch of documents that had been contained and pulled together by Ghislaine Maxwell, who had supposedly organised this sort of whole birthday bash for him. And Donald Trump had written this sort of very weirdly worded and strange conversational card, if you like, with accompanied by the drawn-out naked body of a woman. He talked about the article talked about how he had written his name, depicting it as pubic hair across this woman, and essentially talked a lot about secrets in this. Now, Donald Trump denied it's ever was his writing, denied ever putting it out there, insisting the whole thing was fake. And now he's going after Rupert Murdoch, now he's going after News Corp, and now he's going after the Wall Street Journal, suing them, essentially saying that they have been driving something that is entirely fake. You've got to remember too, Rupert Murdoch and the Fox News Corporation was essentially significant in getting Donald Trump into power back in 2016 and had been essentially, if you like, on his side during a number of key issues. It was only a matter of last week too that Rupert Murdoch and Donald Trump were actually in the same company together. They have known each other for many, many years. And then you fast forward a few days and you've got this extraordinary situation where the president is saying, I look forward to seeing you in the dock, Rupert, and I'm coming after you and I want a great big paycheck.
So is the president a man under pressure or not? Because we heard part of one of your reports for the Today Show at the start of this podcast, and Trump saying that he's never been more popular. Is that true? And do you think this issue is likely to cause him any political pain?
Right now, I certainly think it's causing him personal pain as well as likely some political pain too, because you rarely see him takes so much attention on one particular issue, even if it isn't directly, and he's going down a distraction strategy, whether it is the Obama issue or the Martin Luther King Jr. files released the other day, trying to divert the public's attention, the news organisation's attention into something else. I think he's certainly feeling pressure over this, and given that he has asked his Attorney General to look at these documents, well, maybe is he trying to buy himself some more time over something? And now you've got this report that he was actually told months ago by his Attorney General, look, your name is in the documents. Now, again, the White House is saying, well, they may well be, but that doesn't suggest that there's anything illegal that's actually been done here. So everything needs to be taken in context with this. But going back to your question and going back to the point, look, the MAGA base was promised that this would happen. They are incredibly loyal to him. They are devoted to him. I've been here for 3 years now, been out on the campaign trail, been inside Mar-a-Lago. I've spoken to his supporters there, both the millionaires right down to his grassroots supporters he invites in. And right across the country, you get exactly the same picture. There is almost nothing that will tear them away from him when it comes to loyalty. And it is loyalty that Donald Trump strives for most. But now you've got this extraordinary situation where he's under pressure. He's looking to his supporters, essentially saying, don't believe this stuff that's out there. Don't believe these hoaxes. Don't believe this rubbish. Move on. Focus on something else. What you should be focusing on is this, and try to divert the attention elsewhere. Long term, is it going to cause him political pain? Well, you've got the midterms next November. That might well be a test of how much political pain, and it's going to be the next electoral test of how much political pain this issue could cause him. But it certainly has gone on a lot longer than other issues that have surrounded him. I mean, yes, he was investigated over Russian interference in the 2016 election. That went on for a considerable amount of time, and he wound up being impeached over various issues related to conversations he had, including with Volodymyr Zelensky. But this issue in particular right now, it is hot button, and it's hot button because it directly impacts his base. It basically makes it look like he told his base, and he had his supporters tell his base one thing, and then he went and did another. Now, in the absolute base level of politics, that is an out-and-out campaign lie.
So I feel like we have heard a lot then about how his base and how his supporters feel about this issue, but where do the Democrats stand on all of this? Because I feel like we haven't really heard all that much from that side of politics in relation to this issue. Or have I just not been listening?
Well, no, Jane, you've been listening, but right now they really don't need to say a lot on this. They can sit back and rub their hands together, because what they're essentially seeing is Republicans squabbling amongst themselves. They don't need to be entering into the fight. They are. They're saying, yes, the documents should all be released. They said that they should be released, so release the documents. And they're putting the pressure back on the Trump administration. But right now, you've got Republicans feuding amongst themselves, and when it comes to the rules of politics, well, essentially, if you've got one side bickering amongst themselves, why wade into the fight? You can just leave them to it and let them scrap it out. So that's the situation you've got right now. Republicans, certainly some, at least in Congress, are arguing amongst themselves over this issue, and it's doing the base no good whatsoever. So the Democrats would just be sitting back watching this all unfold.
Well, in terms of letting one side destroy itself, I can certainly see some reflections of Australian politics in that, Jono, but we'll get to that at the end of this. But right now, I'd like you to get out your crystal ball for us, if you could. Do you think we will ever get to the bottom of the Epstein files, this notorious alleged client list? Is more information ever going to be released? And even if it is, will it ever be enough to satisfy those conspiracy theorists? What do you reckon?
Well, exactly. That's the multi-million-dollar question in all of this, really, isn't it? Is any damaging information about anybody related to Jeffrey Epstein ever going to be released? If they're related to either side of politics, well, I think you'll find that both sides would wind up probably not wanting those documents to be made public. Is Donald Trump going to want anything out there that could possibly use to either incriminate him or damage him in this scandal? Absolutely not. He would be making sure that people are going through stuff with a fine-tooth comb. He was advised a couple of months ago, according to these latest reports in the Wall Street Journal, his name was in these documents. So, and then now we're hearing that he actually was believes he never was told that in the first place anyway. So you've got this very, very delicate situation going on. Look, is there an Epstein actual client list? And I think that's largely what people are asking for. We keep hearing about this client list, something Pam Bondi had said that she was in possession of, was asked about, and then said, oh no, I wasn't talking about that when I said I would release it. What I meant was all of the files were on my desk. Well, I mean, she's going to have a very big desk to be holding up hundreds of thousands, potentially, of pages of documents. But it's interesting too, because Jeffrey Epstein's former lawyer believes that a client list doesn't exist either. So look, are we actually ever going to get any daylight on anything that might be useful for prosecutors? Well, that's the multi-million-dollar question, because right now there's a fight in the courts to have some information released. But right now, as it stands, I don't think you're going to see too much incriminating information released about anybody high profile from either side of politics at this stage. But again, there's been many twists and turns in this story. There might be a few more yet.
Yeah, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. Finally, Jono, on this podcast, we like to take our listeners a little bit behind the scenes. I'm curious, as a journalist, what is it like covering the Trump White House and these sorts of stories that keep cropping up for an Australian audience?
Well, it's a case of never turn your phone off, and most of the time don't take your eyes off your phone, because with the Trump administration you can get a case of whiplash almost, because there's, at least certainly in the first 6 months, it's been chaotic, it's been busy, it's been exactly as you would expect it to be for a Trump administration. We're bizarrely sitting in some sort of period of calm now, even though the Epstein saga and scandal continues and the questions go on. There hasn't been the sort of whiplash effect politics we've seen by President Trump that we saw in the sort of first 100 days or so. But you look at what's taken place so far, well, I mean, you've got Australia, when it comes to Australian audiences, what do we want to know? Well, we want to know about tariffs. What's he doing with tariffs? We want to know about AUKUS. Is he going to follow through with the $360-odd billion plan to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines? What's he going to do about China in the Indo-Pacific region? Obviously, there's concern about what's he going to do with the war between Israel and Hamas that he said he could solve very, very quickly, and that still goes. The war between Russia and Ukraine said he would have done in a day. That still goes. So when it comes to the Trump administration, look, constantly paying attention to almost everything that comes out of the White House and everything that comes out of his mouth, because he can change and pivot things at the drop of a hat. He could throw a curveball in that you never even saw coming, and all of a sudden you've got a whole nother tangent, a whole nother story. But I think from the Australian perspective, clearly people back there have their own thoughts, and by all means, let us know your thoughts on anything going on, and we will endeavour to look into them as best we possibly can. But right now, absolutely, Trump administration is absolutely dead centre of the eye for us in the US Bureau, focusing on how does this relationship impact us in our own backyard, in a place where you've got China trying to take a more aggressive, more assertive position. The United States has long been one of Australia's most trusted, most loyal allies. We've got a crucial defence and security and intelligence relationship with them. And how is that going to be impacted under this president, who seems to be spending more time looking elsewhere around the world? So I think it's certainly a case of, everybody just keep watching this space. We're only 6 months in. We've got 3.5 more years of Trump 2.0 to go, Jane. Get a coffee.
Well, I did want to ask you one final question about that, because you're obviously covering America for an Australian audience. Before you were our US correspondent, you were a federal political correspondent in Canberra. So I'm curious, do you see any kind of parallels here with Australian politics, or perhaps any information that Anthony Albanese should be gleaning from this saga or anything else as he continues to try and get that somewhat elusive first meeting with President Trump?
Well, I'd never be one to give any sort of politician advice, but I reckon if you're Anthony Albanese, you want to steer as far away from the Epstein saga as you possibly can. And I reckon being half a world away in another hemisphere, you probably couldn't get much better off at the moment. Obviously, look, he's trying to forge his own relationship with Donald Trump, trying to find that first sort of crucial face-to-face meeting he was supposed to have at the G7 that then got postponed because the president wound up going and launching strikes on Iran. I think for Anthony Albanese, he too will know that he has to try and have some sort of relationship with the President of the United States of America, because, as I said, that relationship has been historic. It's been decades long. It is one that has been forged in battle. We've served alongside American service personnel and died alongside them in conflicts that have lasted for over decades worth of conflicts, the Vietnam War right through into wars in Afghanistan and Iraq too. So this is it's a very important relationship. The Prime Minister knows that. He doesn't need an Australian journalist on the other side of the world telling him how to deal with that relationship or what to do with it. But I think from an Australian perspective, it really just is important to see where is the President's focus. And obviously, Anthony Albanese had a close relationship with Joe Biden. Scott Morrison had a close relationship with Donald Trump. Parallels in politics, you don't see too many here. I think the issue I see here more than ever is how much people wear their politics on their sleeves here. They identify as being Democrat or Republican. And what you've seen here in the United States over the course of the last few years or so is that division, that gulf between both sides, has just got wider and wider and wider. And what you're talking about is a country of 330 million people. You go to Australia, where obviously right now the sort of Republican mould, if you like, the Liberal Party has got its own massive problems with some of the lowest seat numbers they've had post sort of any election. It really is a dire situation for them. You're dealing with a country there of some 26, 27 million people. It's an entirely different realm. Australia likes to think of itself with the United States as having this very closely forged relationship, that we matter a lot to the United States and to the other part of the world. And right now, the sense you get from the Trump administration is, look, Australia actually just is not that important. Donald Trump is more interested in money. He's more interested in financial deals he can do with Japan, with South Korea, with trying to get revenue into the United States of America. So look, there's some parallels, and yes, we have a left and a right of politics in Australia and in the United States of America. The only lesson maybe Anthony Albanese could have taken up was a golf lesson or two. So.
Well, that could help, who knows. Jonathan Kersley, I have loved talking with you. I could talk about this for a long time. Thank you so much for joining us on today's Take.
Always happy to talk to you, Jane. Thanks very much for having us on, and stay tuned to 9 News because we'll give you all the latest from here in the United States of America.
A big thank you to 9's US correspondent Jonathan Kersley for his insights into this fascinating story that continues to make headlines. And thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Today's Take. If you have, please subscribe and give us a rating, and take some time to listen to some of our previous episodes while you're here. We'll be back again next week. Until then, I'll see you bright and early with the rest of the Today team. Have a great day.